The murder of a police officer is always a high-profile crime. We will showcase the most incredible cases where criminals sought revenge against law enforcement, killed out of jealousy and sometimes simply for pleasure. Towards the end, there's a story worthy of a movie, where a police officer decided to punish his own colleagues for corruption, but they declared a hunt for him. Micah Xavier Johnson. One of the most prominent and large-scale crimes on our list that shook the world occurred on July 7, 2016 in Dallas, Texas. 5 police officers were killed that day. The incident took place during demonstrations dedicated to the memory of 2 African-American men, Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, who had been killed by the police in July 2016. While some peacefully expressed their civic stance and tried to combat injustice with words, others had more radical plans. Micah Johnson decided to unleash a real massacre, hiding in a local college building. As a result, 7 police officers were killed, and 10, including 2 civilians who were caught in the crossfire, were wounded. The criminal was eliminated in an unconventional way. A remotely operated robot was sent to him, carrying an explosive charge. This marked the first instance in history where a criminal was neutralized remotely, without a conventional assault and without risking human lives. Micah Xavier Johnson was a relatively young man, born on July 2, 1991, an African-American from Mesquite, Texas. He was a member of the U.S. military and had served in Afghanistan. Prior to the events, he had not engaged in any illegal activities and had a good reputation in his former unit. However, the echoes of war and emotional protests severely affected his mental state, leading him to commit this massacre. The next case is an example of cruel injustice and the irony of fate, which doesn't spare some of us. Nurlan Muratov. 23-year-old police officer Andrey Muchaev was found dead at the Kuzskaya metro station in Moscow. He had been shot twice in the head. According to the investigation, the perpetrator shot the police officer when he stopped him for a routine document check. The suspect in the murder is 43-year-old Nurlan Muratov. He had come to Moscow to find work and had no registration or work permit. What's particularly cruel about this case? Andrei was resigning from law enforcement. His resignation had already been accepted, and he was working his final shift. He was just a few hours away from starting a new life. Andrei left behind a wife and a young son. Nurlan Muratov was sentenced to 18 years of strict regime and ordered to pay 500,000 rubles in compensation to the deceased officer's family. The next case is a peculiar vendetta that occurred in New York and shook the entire city. Ismail Brinsley. An African-American man killed 2 police officers, Wenjian Liu and Rafael Ramos, in Brooklyn, and then fled towards the nearest subway station, where he killed himself upon seeing approaching officers. According to the New York Post, the murders may have been in retaliation for the deaths of African Americans at the hands of U.S. police officers. This is vengeance, the New York Post quotes a source within the law enforcement agencies of New York. As reported, 3 hours before the murder, the perpetrator posted a photo of a gun on Instagram with the caption, "They killed one of ours, let's kill 2 of theirs. Maybe this is my last post." The motive of revenge is a relatively common guest in crimes related to the killing of police officers, and the next case is a blatant attempt to settle scores for a loved one. Kevin Johnson. On July 5, 2005, police officers including William McIntyre were searching for Kevin Johnson on suspicion of violating probation. During a search at Johnson's home, his 12-year-old brother had a seizure. According to Johnson, the police prevented the Johnson family from calling an ambulance and providing him with adequate medical care, ultimately leading to his death in the hospital. Johnson accused the police, believing they were indirectly responsible for the death of his beloved younger brother. Later the same evening, one of these officers, Sergeant William McIntyre, returned to Mitcham Park. He suggested to another officer to handle a complaint about fireworks, since he was closer to the incident. Suddenly, Johnson, who was watching the police, opened fire on McIntyre, hitting him multiple times. McIntyre drove a short distance, crashed, and was ejected from the car. Johnson approached him and shot him again in the head, but McIntyre didn't die immediately, succumbing to his injuries a day later in the hospital. The next case is an absurd situation where one cop accidentally took down another, and such things happen. Greg Brachle. Several police officers surrounded and blocked off a Lexus with suspects, which was parked behind a roadside snack bar. Lieutenant Greg Brachle, one of the first to storm the scene, approached the car. He believed that one of the individuals inside the car had a gun, so he immediately opened fire without warning. For an unknown reason, the law enforcement officer ignored the fact that in addition to 2 drug dealers, his fellow detective Jacob Grant was also in the car. Shortly before the described events, Detective Grant had been undercover within a criminal organization. Due to this strange oversight, the cop undercover received 8 bullets striking his neck, chest, shoulders and arms. Initially, Brachle did not realize his mistake. He retreated behind another vehicle and began shouting various demands. It was only after some time that the lieutenant realized that the shredded body in front of him was that of his colleague. The grief-stricken officer approached the Lexus and asked the detective if he was okay. "No," Grant replied laconically on his last breath. Following this, the law enforcement officers arrested the subdued drug dealers. Apparently, the criminals began to seriously fear for their lives and chose not to resist, complying with all the orders. Beat your own so that the strangers will fear. Omar Cueva. A law enforcement officer died after stopping a vehicle for excessive window tinting. According to the investigation, the officer accidentally encountered an armed drug courier who shot him with the rifle. Afterward, the slain officer's colleagues caught up with and killed the perpetrator. Law enforcement officers released footage that captured the death of police officer Darian Jarrett, who was shot on February 4th of this year on a highway in the state of New Mexico in the southwestern United States. The police officer pulled over a white pickup truck. The reason for heightened attention was the excessive tint on the car's side windows. After a brief conversation, the patrolman asked the driver, 39-year-old Omar Felix Cueva, to step out of the vehicle. It's noted that during this interaction, the officer noticed the weapon inside the pickup and requested the rifle for inspection. The perpetrator grabbed an AR-15 rifle and, circling the vehicle, opened fire on the law enforcement officer. When the wounded police officer fell to the ground, the man finished him with a shot to the back of the head and fled the scene of the murder. After some time, the slain officer was discovered, and personnel from several law enforcement agencies embarked on a pursuit of the perpetrator. They engaged in multiple shootouts, rammed his vehicle, and attempted to stop it by deploying spikes on the road. However, Omar Cueva managed to drive another 60 kilometers before succumbing to several gunshot wounds, which proved fatal. It's known that during the pursuit, another law enforcement officer was wounded. The police officer's killer had a previous criminal record. He had been arrested for transporting several kilograms of amphetamines. At that time, in addition to drugs, a rifle was also found in the perpetrator's vehicle. Alexey Yushin. Inspectors decided to stop the car in which the suspect was returning from the store with his elderly mother after noticing the absence of license plates. But Yushin evidently understood the peril he faced if the contents of his trunk were discovered. Upon exiting the car, he immediately opened fire on the police officer, while his terrified mother remained in the vehicle. Lieutenant Alexey Markov was killed on the spot. Yushin was eventually stopped by the partner of the slain police officer, who fired several shots at the suspect with his service weapon. Wounded, Yushin was taken to the hospital and questioned. Investigators will need to determine where the suspect obtained the weapon and, more importantly, the motive. However, this isn't the only fact that prompted detectives to transfer the investigation of this murder to a unit handling particularly important cases. Yushin had been involved in far-right ideologies, frequently wore military-style clothing, and often engaged in disputes with his neighbors. The deceased police officer left behind a wife and 4 young children. They are convinced that Alexei fulfilled his duty and did everything to ensure this ended without bloodshed, but fate had other plans. David Ware. The driver, David Anthony Ware, 33 years old, refused to exit his car when the police told him they were going to tow it. Unexpectedly, he pulled out a gun and fired several shots at the police officers when they attempted to remove him from the vehicle. 26-year-old Orash Zakishan, who had recently completed his training at the police academy and had been on patrol for only a couple of weeks, was critically injured, but eventually recovered. However, his partner was less fortunate. Sergeant Craig Johnson, a 15-year veteran of the Tulsa Police Department, underwent emergency surgery that lasted over 10 hours but did not survive. David Ware is still on trial. His sister, Ashley Melendai, spoke to local media, stating that she doesn't believe her brother could be a murderer and considers his actions purely self-defense. And next, another mass shooting of police officers that occurred relatively recently. Lance Stortz. On June 30, 2022, in Allen, Kentucky, USA, a mass shootout involving police officers took place. 3 police officers and a police dog were killed, and 4 others were injured, including 3 police officers. The suspected shooter, 49-year-old Lance Stortz, was arrested and charged with the murder and attempted murder of a police officer the day after the shooting. He did not plead guilty and was remanded to jail with a bail set at $10 million. Naturally, no one paid such an amount for the killer. Moreover, the case did not go to trial. On February 28, 2023, Stortz was found dead in his prison cell in the Pike County Detention Center, an apparent suicide. Authorities reported that Stortz had hanged himself next to the bus stop in his cell, leaving no note. This situation raised questions from the public, with some speculating that the police sought their own justice for the killing of their colleagues. But this theory lacked evidence, though we had to mention it. And the next crime is a story of jealousy and love, as police officers are not exempt from life's passions. Andrey Muchaev. In the Yamal-Nenets Autonomous Okrug, the bodies of 2 local police officers were discovered, one with a gunshot wound to the chest found inside a car, and another with head injury found in the police precinct office. A criminal case was initiated in connection with the incident. Shortly before the tragedy, one of the lieutenants learned about his wife's meetings with the second police officer. As a result, he allegedly snapped and took out his colleague in the police station. Local media outlets note that the body of the murdered police officer's spouse, presumably Andrey Muchaev, was also found in one of the apartment units in a 5-story building. Bullet traces were reportedly visible on the door. After committing the crime, the local police officer decided to end his life, doing so in his own car. Moreover, according to statements from acquaintances who knew the local police officers, Andrey had been struggling with his wife's infidelity for several weeks and had expressed the desire to end his life on multiple occasions, but no one took it seriously. Even acquaintances from law enforcement agencies did not give it much thought. And then there's that particular case that should be made into a movie, a story of retribution and a genuine manhunt staged by the police. Christopher Dorner. In the United States, a former police officer who declared a real war against his corrupt colleagues from the Los Angeles Police Department has been eliminated. 33-year-old Christopher Dorner wrote in a manifesto that he was dismissed due to his principles and would now fight against wrongdoing within law enforcement agencies. After Dorner began killing cops and members of their families, authorities regarded his actions as internal terrorism. Dorner became a fugitive when it became known that he had killed the daughter of his former colleague and her fiancé. Then the former cop attacked a patrol car, killing 1 police officer and injuring his partner. There were several more attacks that are specifically linked to Dorner, but the victims survived. The police offered a record reward of $1 million for information about his whereabouts, and the funds for this were taken from some private funds that for some reason suddenly became involved in the search. In the end, the renegade was tracked down. Sources from the Los Angeles Times claim that he arrived in the city of San Bernardino in a stolen car. A few days before that, Dorner broke into the home of a married couple, tied up the owners and stole their pickup truck, but left them alive. When the police officers approached the vehicle, he opened fire on them with an automatic rifle. In the shootout, Dorner killed the deputy sheriff and wounded another police officer. Then, realizing he had nowhere to go, he barricaded himself in a small wooden house. The Special Forces team that arrived at the scene surrounded the building and offered the criminal a chance to surrender. Instead of responding, Dorner made a final attempt to break out of the encirclement, but the special agents returned fire. The cabin caught fire, and the former cop apparently shot himself in a hopeless situation. Who received the reward money remains a mystery. Being a police officer is a tremendous risk where you never know where a bullet might come from, whether from a criminal during a routine document check or sometimes from an inattentive colleague.